She burned me. The scream sliced through the glass-walled penthouse before anyone could even process what had happened, sharp and trembling. The kind of voice that demanded belief before evidence. And in a room where power was measured in millions of dollars and whispered reputations, belief came fast and without question. The chandelier above cast warm gold across marble floors imported from Italy, each tile worth more than most people's monthly rent. And right in the center of it all stood a small girl who didn't belong. Amara Johnson, 8 years old, her worn sneakers barely making a sound against the polished surface. Her hoodie of faded gray that looked out of place among tailored suits and silk dresses stood completely still. In front of her, Sophia Whitmore clutched her wrist, her breath uneven, her expression a perfect blend of shock and hurt, the red mark on her skin already drawing eyes, already telling a story that no one questioned. A server rushed forward, apologizing. Another guest stepped back as if distance alone could separate them from the tension. And somewhere near the bar someone whispered, "Who let her in here?" It wasn't a question meant to be answered, just a judgment already formed. Amara didn't move. She didn't cry, didn't look down, didn't run to her mother or try to explain herself the way a child should. Her eyes stayed forward, steady in a way that felt almost unsettling, as if she understood something no one else in that room did. "She looked right at me," Sophia said, her voice shaking just enough to sound real. And then she dropped it. The words spread quickly, moving through the room like a current, turning heads, shifting loyalties, building a narrative that felt complete before it had even begun. Security stepped closer, hands gentle but firm as they reached for Amara's arm. And she allowed it, offering no resistance, no protest, just silence that made the moment heavier. The elevator doors at the far end of the penthouse opened with a soft chime, and everything changed. Daniel Kong stepped out without hurry, his presence cutting through the tension before he even spoke. He had just come from closing a $42 million deal downtown, a negotiation that had taken months and ended with a single signature. And yet this small, contained scene pulled every ounce of attention the room had. Conversations died mid-sentence. Glasses paused halfway to lips, and even the city lights beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows seemed to fade into the background. Daniel's gaze moved once across the room, precise, controlled, taking in the details the way he always did. Sophia, elegant even in distress, the mark on her wrist catching the light. The staff already aligned, already defensive. And then the girl, small, still, watching. For a fraction of a second, something unreadable passed through his eyes, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the calm authority that had built everything he owned. "What happened?" he asked, his voice low, measured, carrying just enough weight to silence any lingering doubt. And in that moment, before a single answer was given, before truth or lies could separate themselves, the outcome felt decided, because in a room like this, truth didn't come from what happened. It came from who was believed. The silence after Daniel Kang's question did not feel empty. It felt controlled, like every person in that room was waiting for permission to think, and that permission did not belong to them. Sophia Whitmore took a small step forward, her posture shifting from shock to something more deliberate, something composed, as if she had already decided how this moment would be remembered. "She dropped hot tea on me," she said, her voice softer now but no less certain. "I was standing right here and she just looked at me and let it fall." The words settled quickly, too quickly, wrapping themselves around the room like truth before anyone had time to question them. Daniel did not respond immediately. He turned his head slightly, eyes moving from Sophia's trembling hand to the small figure being held near the edge of the marble floor. The security guard's grip on Amara's arm was firm but not rough, the kind of hold used more for control than punishment. Yet even that felt excessive when placed against the stillness of the child. "Is that what happened?" Daniel asked, but the question was not directed at the room. It was directed at the person least expected to answer. Amara lifted her eyes just enough to meet his, and for a brief moment, the distance between them felt impossible to measure. Not in meters, not in wealth, not even in language, but in something deeper, something that decided whose voice mattered. "Yes," she said quietly. There was no hesitation, no trembling, no attempt to soften the word. Just one answer. Simple. Final. Around them, the tension shifted into something almost comfortable. A few guests exhaled. Someone near the window nodded as if a problem had been resolved. The narrative had closed itself neatly, and that was enough for most of them. But Daniel did not move. His gaze lingered, not on her face, but on her hands. Small. Still. And then, almost imperceptibly, his eyes dropped to the faint redness along her fingers. A detail so subtle it could have been ignored by anyone who was not trained to notice what others overlooked. He straightened slowly, his expression unchanged. Yet something in his posture suggested that the answer he had been given did not settle as cleanly inside him as it had for everyone else. "Call building management," one of the staff members said under his breath. "This should not happen in a residence like this." Another voice followed, lower but sharper. "Her family should be held responsible." The words were not directed at Daniel, but they were meant for him to hear, carefully placed suggestions disguised as concern. Sophia stepped closer again, her presence reclaiming the center of the room. "It is not a big deal," she said, almost gracious now. "I just do not want her here anymore." The phrasing was gentle, but the meaning was absolute. Remove the problem. Restore the order. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, the smallest visible reaction, but enough for those who knew him to recognize that he was thinking, calculating, measuring more than what was being said aloud. He turned once more toward Amara, and for the first time, the room noticed that he had not dismissed her yet. "Why were you here?" he asked. The question was different now. Not about the incident. About her existence in that space. Amara did not answer immediately. Her eyes flickered for just a second toward the service hallway, where a cleaning cart stood half-hidden behind a polished column, and then back to him. "I was waiting," she said. Waiting for what? She did not explain. And strangely, no one asked, because in that moment it did not seem important. What mattered was what had already been decided. What mattered was who stood where. And as the city lights shimmered beyond the glass walls, reflecting a world built on power and perception, one thing became quietly, undeniably clear. In this room, truth was not something discovered. It was something assigned. And Daniel Kong had just been handed his first version of it. Daniel Kong did not respond right away, and that silence began to stretch in a way that made people uneasy, because in his world, silence was never empty, it was a decision forming. His eyes moved again, slower this time, tracing the invisible lines that connected everyone in the room, from Sophia standing at the center with controlled vulnerability to the staff position just close enough to intervene, and finally back to Amara, who remained exactly where she had been, as if the weight of the moment had not shifted her even a single centimeter. It was not defiance, it was something else, something quieter and harder to define. Daniel took one step closer, the sound of his shoes against the marble floor echoing softly, and the movement alone caused the room to tighten again, as if everyone instinctively understood that whatever came next would not be small. He stopped at a distance that still kept him above her, still preserved the hierarchy that no one questioned, and then he spoke, his voice calm but sharper now. "If you did it," he said, "then you understand what that means." It was not a threat, not directly, but it carried the weight of consequence, the kind that did not need to be explained. Amara looked up at him again, and for the first time, there was the slightest flicker in her expression. Not fear, but something closer to hesitation, as if she was measuring what to say next against something far bigger than herself. "Yes," she repeated, softer this time. Around them, the room seemed to settle further into that answer, the simplicity of it allowing everyone else to relax into certainty, because certainty was comfortable, especially when it aligned with expectation. Sophia lowered her hands slightly, her breathing more controlled now, her role shifting seamlessly from victim to someone who had already moved on, someone who expected resolution without complication. "I do not want this to become a scene," she said gently, glancing toward Daniel with an expression that balanced concern and restraint. "It is just, I should feel safe here." The words were chosen carefully, not accusing him, but placing responsibility in his hands without saying it directly. Daniel's gaze did not leave Amara. There was something about the way she stood, the way her shoulders did not collapse under the attention. the way her eyes did not dart away, that continued to disrupt the clean narrative he had been given. He had seen fear before countless times in negotiations, in confrontations, in moments where power made itself known, and this did not look like fear. This looked like control, but not the kind that came from authority, the kind that came from decision. "Who were you waiting for?" he asked again, his tone quieter now, almost conversational. But the question carried more weight than before. Amara's eyes shifted once more, briefly, toward the service hallway, and this time Daniel followed that glance. The cleaning cart was still there, slightly out of place in a room where everything else had been arranged with precision, its metal frame catching the light in a way that felt oddly exposed. A detail, small, easy to ignore, except Daniel did not ignore details. "Answer me," he said, not louder but firmer. Amara hesitated, and this time the pause lasted just long enough to draw attention, just long enough to make the room lean in again. "My mom," she said finally. The words landed differently than the others had. Softer, heavier, real. A murmur passed through a few of the guests, subtle but present, as the context began to shift, even if only slightly. Staff. Family of staff. Not supposed to be here. Daniel's expression did not change, but something behind it did. Something that began to fracture the certainty he had been handed minutes earlier. He turned his head slightly, looking toward the hallway again, and for a brief second, the scene no longer felt complete. Felt like a piece was missing. And in that space, that small gap between what was seen and what was understood, doubt began to take its first real shape. The name lingered in the air longer than anyone expected, as if it carried more weight than a simple answer should. And Daniel Kong felt it settle somewhere behind his composed expression, not enough to change his stance, but enough to slow his next decision. "Your mother?" he repeated, his voice even. But now there was a trace of something else beneath it, something quieter, more deliberate. Amara nodded once, a small motion, almost invisible, but it confirmed everything without adding anything new, and somehow that made it more difficult to dismiss. From the far end of the room, a woman's voice broke through, strained and breathless. "Amara!" The sound cut across the polished silence with a kind of urgency that did not belong in a place like this, and all eyes turned as a woman in a simple uniform stepped forward from the service hallway. Her movements quick but cautious, as if she knew she was crossing a line she was not supposed to cross. Her name tag caught the light briefly as she approached, the letters slightly worn from years of use, and when she reached the edge of the gathering, she stopped, her posture shifting instantly from urgency to restraint. "Sir," she said, lowering her head just enough to show respect without losing her balance. "I am sorry, she was not supposed to be here." Daniel recognized her. Not immediately, not by name but by presence. She had been part of the building longer than most of the guests in this room. Someone who moved quietly through spaces like this without ever being seen. Someone who made sure everything remained perfect without ever being acknowledged. That recognition did not soften his expression, but it did anchor something in place. "Then why is she here?" he asked, and the question was directed at the woman now, not the child. The woman hesitated, her eyes flickering briefly toward Amara, then back to Daniel, calculating what could be said and what had to remain unsaid. "I had no one to watch her tonight," she admitted, her voice steady but low. "I thought she would stay in the hallway." A murmur passed through a few of the guests, not loud enough to interrupt, but enough to signal disapproval, the kind that came from people who had never needed to make that kind of decision. Sophia shifted slightly, her composure returning fully now, her hand resting more naturally at her side, the redness still visible but no longer the center of attention. "This is exactly what I mean," she said, her tone calm, almost sympathetic, but carefully measured. "There are boundaries for a reason." The words were directed at Daniel, but they carried a broader implication, one that placed responsibility not just on the situation but on him. Daniel's gaze moved between them, from the woman who stood carefully at the edge of the room to the child who had not moved from her place, and then back to Sophia, who stood at the center of it all as if she had always belonged there. The contrast was precise, almost too precise, and for the first time the narrative felt constructed rather than natural. "Did you see it happen?" Daniel asked, turning back to Sophia. The question shifted the balance again, subtle but important, and for a brief moment, something flickered in her expression before it settled into certainty. "I felt it," she said, choosing her words carefully. "And I saw her holding the cup." It was not a direct answer, but it was enough for most people in the room. Enough to maintain the version of events that had already taken hold. Daniel nodded slightly, as if accepting the explanation, but his eyes did not fully agree. They moved once more to Amara, and this time, he noticed something he had not seen before. Something small but impossible to ignore once it appeared. The edge of her sleeve was damp, darker than the rest of the fabric, as if it had absorbed more than just a passing spill, and beneath that, the faint outline of heat against her skin told a different story than the one that had been told aloud. He did not react immediately. He did not point it out or question it. Instead, he straightened, his expression returning to its usual control, and for a moment, it looked as if he was about to end the situation entirely, to accept what had been presented and move on. But the room did not feel settled. Not anymore, because now, even without understanding why, Daniel Kong knew one thing with absolute certainty. Something in this story did not align, and he had just realized he might have accepted the wrong version first. Daniel Kong did not speak immediately, and this time the silence carried a different weight, no longer the calm authority of someone in control, but the careful restraint of someone who had just noticed something that did not belong. His eyes remained on Amara's sleeve, on the faint darkened fabric that told a quieter story than the one being repeated around him, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, his attention began to shift away from Sophia. It was not obvious to most of the room, but those closest to him felt it, the slight change in direction, the subtle rebalancing of focus that signaled something deeper was unfolding. "Let go of her," he said, his voice low but firm, and the security guard released Amara immediately, stepping back without question. The movement itself changed the space, removing the physical hold that had defined her position, but Amara did not move forward or backward. She remained exactly where she was, as if the absence of restraint did not grant her freedom, only visibility. Sophia's posture stiffened for a fraction of a second before she smoothed it out, her composure returning just as quickly, but Daniel had already seen it. "Daniel," she said gently, stepping closer. "There is no need to make this complicated." Her tone was careful, supportive on the surface, but underneath it carried a quiet urgency, a desire to close the moment before it expanded beyond control. Daniel did not respond to her. Instead, he shifted his attention fully to Amara, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed, not louder, not harsher, but more precise. "Show me your hands." The request was simple, but it did not feel optional. Amara hesitated for the first time, her fingers curling slightly as if holding onto something invisible, and then slowly, she lifted her hands. The room leaned in without realizing it, drawn by the quiet gravity of the gesture. The redness along her skin was clearer now, more defined, stretching across her fingers and the base of her palm in a way that did not match a single careless spill. It suggested contact, sustained, closer than what had been described. A murmur moved through the crowd again, softer this time, uncertain. Daniel studied her hands without touching them, his expression unreadable, but his mind already moving through possibilities, measuring details against the narrative he had accepted just minutes earlier. "How long ago?" he asked, not looking at anyone else. Amara did not answer immediately. Her eyes flickered toward her mother, who stood frozen at the edge of the room, her face pale, her hands clenched together as if holding back something that could not be undone once released. "Answer him," Sophia said quietly, her voice still calm but now edged with something sharper, something less patient. The shift was small, but it was enough. Daniel's gaze lifted from Amara's hands and settled briefly on Sophia, and in that moment, the room felt it, the tension tightening again, but in a different direction. "She will answer when she is ready," Daniel said, and the words landed with quiet authority, not raised, not forced, but final. It was the first time he had contradicted Sophia, and it did not go unnoticed. Amara lowered her hands slightly, but did not drop them completely, as if she understood that this moment mattered in a way that went beyond the question itself. "It was already hot," she said softly. The sentence was simple, but it did not fit cleanly into what had been established. Already hot. Not spilled in anger. Not dropped in defiance. Something else. Daniel's eyes narrowed just slightly, not in suspicion of her, but in recognition of the gap between what he had been told and what he was now hearing. "Who poured it?" he asked. The room held its breath again, but this time the certainty that had filled it earlier was gone. Now there was only anticipation and something more dangerous. Doubt. The question did not echo loudly, but it lingered in the room with a weight that made everyone aware that something had shifted, something irreversible. "Who poured it?" Daniel Kang's voice remained steady, but now it carried a precision that cut deeper than volume ever could. Amara's lips parted slightly, and for the first time since the accusation, her composure wavered just enough to be seen, not as fear, but as calculation, the kind that did not belong to someone her age, the kind that suggested she understood exactly what her answer would change. Her eyes moved again, not toward Sophia this time, but toward her mother, who stood frozen at the edge of the room, her hands trembling just enough to betray what she was trying to contain. The woman shook her head almost imperceptibly, a silent plea, not for truth, but for protection. Amara saw it. She understood it, and that understanding settled into her expression like something heavy. "It was me," she said. The words were quiet, but they landed harder than before, because this time, they did not resolve anything. They complicated everything. A ripple of relief passed through part of the room, those who preferred simple answers clinging to the statement as confirmation, but others hesitated, their certainty no longer as firm. Daniel did not move. His gaze remained fixed on her, and in that stillness, the contradiction began to take shape. "You poured it," he repeated, not as agreement but as a test. Amara nodded once. "And then you dropped it," he continued. Another nod. The sequence sounded complete, but it felt wrong, like a story missing a piece that refused to stay hidden. Sophia stepped forward again, her presence reclaiming space that had begun to drift away from her. "Daniel, this is exactly what I said," she insisted, her voice gentle but firmer now. She admitted it. There was a subtle urgency beneath her tone, a need to close the gap before it widened further. Daniel turned his head slightly, his eyes meeting hers, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. It was not confrontation, not yet, but it was no longer alignment either. "Did you see her pour it?" he asked. The question was simple, but it landed differently this time. Sophia hesitated just for a fraction of a second, but in a room trained to notice everything, that fraction was enough. I saw her holding the cup," she said, adjusting her words carefully. "And then it happened. Not a lie, not fully, but not the same as before." Daniel looked back at Amara, and now the space between their answers felt wider than before, not because of what was said, but because of what was missing. "Why did you say you did it?" he asked quietly. The question was no longer about the incident. It was about intention. Amara's shoulders shifted slightly, the smallest sign of tension breaking through her stillness, and again her eyes moved toward her mother. The woman's lips pressed together, her breath shallow, as if holding back words that could not be taken back once spoken. The room noticed now, not the details, not fully, but the pattern, the connection. Something was being protected. Daniel followed that line, his attention moving from child to mother and back again, and suddenly the situation was no longer contained within a single moment. It stretched beyond it, into something older, something hidden beneath layers of silence and necessity. "Look at me," he said softly. Amara did, and this time, there was no calculation left in her eyes, only a quiet resolve that felt far too heavy for someone her age. "I did it," she repeated, but now the words sounded different, not like truth, not even like defense, but like a decision she had already made before he ever asked the question. And that was when Daniel Kang understood something that shifted everything inside him. The answer she was giving was not meant to explain what happened. It was meant to protect someone else. The realization did not come as a shock. It came as a slow, precise alignment of details that no longer fit the story he had been given. And once Daniel Kong saw it, he could not unsee it. The room still believed the situation was simple, that a child had admitted fault and a resolution was already forming. But Daniel no longer stood in that version of events. He shifted his weight slightly, a subtle movement that drew attention without effort. And when he spoke again, his voice was quieter than before, but sharper in intention. "Why are you protecting her?" he asked. The question did not point directly at anyone, but its direction was unmistakable. Amara's eyes widened just slightly, the first true break in her control, and then she looked away, not toward Sophia, not toward the room, but toward her mother. The woman froze, her breath catching, her posture tightening as if the question itself had reached her before she could prepare for it. "Sir, please," she said quickly, stepping forward half a step before stopping herself. "She is just a child. She does not understand." The words came too fast, too practiced, and Daniel heard it immediately. He did not respond to the explanation. Instead, he watched the space between them, the invisible line that connected mother and daughter, the silent communication that had already decided what would be said and what would never be spoken. "She understands more than you think," Daniel replied, his tone calm. But now there was something else beneath it, something that had shifted from observation to intention. Around them, the room began to feel less certain, the earlier confidence dissolving into quiet unease as people sensed that the situation was no longer moving toward a quick resolution. Sophia's expression tightened, just for a moment, before she stepped forward again, reclaiming the center with practiced ease. "Daniel, this is unnecessary," she said, her voice still controlled, but now edged with impatience. She already admitted what happened. The statement was meant to close the conversation, to pull it back into the version that had served her, but it no longer held the same weight. Daniel turned his head slightly toward her, and for the first time since he had entered the room, there was distance in his gaze. Not anger, not yet, but separation. "She admitted something," he said. "That does not make it true." The words landed differently than anything he had said before, and the room felt it immediately. A shift, a fracture. Amara's mother lowered her eyes, her hands trembling more visibly now, and Daniel noticed the way she avoided looking at Sophia entirely, as if even that small action carried risk. It was not fear of him. It was fear of something else, something older, something that had been decided long before tonight. "Look at me," Daniel said, this time to the woman. She hesitated, then slowly lifted her gaze, and in that moment, the tension between them became clear, not as conflict, but as history. Daniel studied her face, searching not for guilt, but for recognition, and after a brief pause, he found it. "You have been here a long time," he said. It was not a question. The woman nodded, her voice barely steady. 10 years, sir. 10 years. Long enough to know how things worked. Long enough to understand consequences. Long enough to stay silent when silence was required. Daniel's gaze shifted back to Amara, and now the pieces began to align in a way that made the situation heavier, not lighter. This was no longer about a spilled drink. It was about a choice, a deliberate one, and the person who made that choice was not the one everyone had been looking at. "You are not protecting yourself," Daniel said quietly, his eyes fixed on Amara. "You are protecting her." The words did not accuse. They revealed. And in that moment, the silence that followed was no longer empty. It was filled with the weight of something that had just been uncovered, something that could not be easily put back into place. The words did not fade when Daniel Kong spoke them. They settled, heavy and undeniable, spreading through the room like a quiet truth that no one had prepared for. And for the first time since the accusation, the focus shifted completely away from the obvious and toward something far more fragile. Amara did not respond immediately, but her silence was no longer empty. It was filled with meaning, with a choice that had already been made long before Daniel asked the question. Her mother's breath became uneven, her composure cracking in small, visible ways that she could no longer fully control, and the distance she had tried to maintain from Sophia now felt deliberate, almost protective. "Sir, please," she said again, But this time her voice carried something different. Not just fear, but urgency. "This is my fault, not hers." The room reacted, not loudly, but noticeably, the shift in attention now pulling toward the woman who had tried to remain invisible just moments ago. Daniel did not interrupt her. He let the statement exist, allowed it to take shape in the silence that followed, and then he asked the only question that mattered. "How?" It was simple, but it demanded truth. The woman hesitated, her eyes lowering as if the answer itself carried weight beyond the moment. And then she spoke carefully, each word chosen not just for accuracy, but for survival. "I prepared the tea," she said. "I left it on the table before I went back to the hallway." The explanation seemed harmless, even logical, but it did not explain everything, and Daniel knew it. His gaze shifted slowly, returning to the exact spot where the incident had happened, replaying the positions, the movements, the angles, the details that others ignored but he could not. "And she just picked it up and dropped it?" he asked, not accusing, but testing. The woman did not answer right away, and that hesitation spoke louder than anything she could say. Sophia stepped forward again, her control slipping just enough to reveal something sharper beneath it. "Daniel, this is going too far," she said, her voice still composed but now clearly strained. "We are questioning staff over something that is already resolved." The word resolved landed awkwardly now, as if it belonged to a version of events that no longer existed. Daniel turned to her, and this time the distance between them was unmistakable. "It is not resolved," he said quietly. The room felt it again, the shift deepening, the certainty dissolving completely. Amara finally moved, just slightly, stepping closer to her mother, not to hide behind her, but to stand beside her, and when she spoke, her voice was soft but clear enough to carry across the room. "She told me not to touch it," Amara said. The statement was small, almost insignificant, but it changed everything. Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in focus. "Who told you that?" he asked. Amara looked directly at him now, and for the first time, there was no hesitation in her answer. "Her," she said, and she did not need to point. The room followed her gaze automatically, and every eye turned toward Sophia Whitmore. The silence that followed was no longer uncertain. It was heavy, charged, and impossible to ignore. Sophia's expression froze for a fraction of a second, just long enough to be seen, and then it shifted back into control.